Welcome everybody. So do I start the slides or you are going to play the slides?
Yeah, sorry, I will share the slides.
Okay. So I have 8 minutes. I'm going to keep it very brief so that we can get the questions. I will wait for the slides. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Next slide, please. When we talk about countering terrorism, there are two important aspects that I would like to discuss at the beginning. From the perspective of intelligence, oftentimes intelligence agencies and the people working for different intelligence departments, the best for them is to wait until the end times of terrorist preparation for the next attack so that they can get enough evidence to prosecute the perpetrators. So from the perspective of intelligence agencies, oftentimes it is not the prevention of recruitment or radicalization of the subjects terrorist organizations are trying to reach. Instead, they try to figure out who are going to be connected and who are going to be part of a wider network. So prevention is always the second or third step from their perspectives. For the counter-terrorism agencies, law enforcement, the police officers dealing with terrorist attacks or counter-terrorism issues, oftentimes the issue is a little bit emotional because when there is a terrorist attack, public emotions are very high. They expect an operation, the arrest of the perpetrators. So from the perspective of the politicians and the public, the CT job is carrying out operations, arresting terrorists, making sure that they are not going to be able to carry out terrorist attacks. But these two approaches do not work in countering terrorism in many cases because these are like very late steps in the intervention towards stopping the final attacks of terrorist activities. Next slide, please. So when we think about prevention of terrorist recruitment, it is very open that through the prevention of terrorist recruitment, we can decrease the numbers of terrorist organization members, which will result in fewer terrorist attacks, which will again result in less casualties. And that means our intelligence agencies, our counterterrorism departments, and other related government agencies and NGOs are going to spend less time to deal with these types of issues. Investigations are very expensive, so we are going to save financially as well, less human resource and capital. And if you think about the load of the judiciary system, it is going to be less through this approach. And of course, at the end, we are going to have less numbers of prisoners related with terrorism. Next slide, please. There are three important elements in this chapter that we need to be aware. I'm not going to read this, but recruitment is the process of how terrorist organizations win the hearts and minds of their subjects so they become dedicated members of their organizations. Radicalization is the process of indoctrination and brainwashing, and also emotional attachment to the members of terrorist organizations. And prevention is, at the end of the day, a systematic approach where we can make sure that we can stop the flow of terrorist recruitment for the point of this chapter. Thank you. Next slide, please. When we think about terrorist recruitment, I would like to emphasize why it is extremely important and how terrorist attacks and the coverage of terrorist attacks are directly tied to the numbers of terrorist recruitment. Oftentimes when we see a terrorist attack, regardless of we want or don't, those terrorist attacks are covered by the media, and particularly now through the social media, which as a result becomes a propaganda, an extensive propaganda for any terrorist organization that carries out such attacks. And this is their desire, to be mentioned by the media and social media, to be seen more powerful than they really are. When they have this extensive widespread propaganda now all over the world, recruitment numbers increase because it helps them to reach out to more people. When we have new terrorists, when we have more recruitment, it results in more terrorist attacks. So this becomes a vicious cycle. And if we cannot stop this cycle at any phase, we are not going to be able to successfully counter terrorism. Next slide, please. When we are dealing with the recruitment process of terrorist organizations, we must know how terrorist organizations or the terrorist organization in question is structured, where they are operating, their jurisdictions, the ideologies, the justifications they use during their recruitment processes. So it is essential that we have extensive knowledge of these elements regarding the terrorist organization in question. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There is also a common recruitment process for terrorist organizations, and we need to be able to understand that recruitment process. And I drew this process based on my experience in the field and the interviews over like maybe 4,000 or 5,000 interviews I carried out with different terrorist organization members. And through my observations, I have this 8-step recruitment and radicalization process, how different terrorist organizations approach to their subjects to essentially recruit them at the end. So this is a very systematic approach carried out by terrorist organizations. Oftentimes their peers and leadership are involved in this process. I'm not going to explain these each one by one, but what I'm going to focus is the third and fourth one, because I think it is the most important element that we need to understand when it comes to the recruitment of terrorist organization members. This process is extremely important because at any given time, if we can interrupt this process by understanding how recruitment works, we are going to be able to reverse the course, basically win maybe the hearts of the subjects terrorist organizations are trying to recruit. Oftentimes, the recruitment process does not start with an ideology. It is based on the friendships, the close circles or family members who are very immediately reachable by the terrorist recruiters at a given space. And from the perspective of terrorist organizations, building a rapport, a close friendship is essential, because through that, they are going to be able to emotionally tie themselves to their subjects, and their subjects are not going to be able to say no to their recruiters. That emotional connect and the close friendship is the key to terrorist recruitment. And during the fourth step, when they are advancing that friendship and making sure that they are slowly starting indoctrination, at the same time, the friendship is processing and they are making sure that their subject is not going to be able to cut their ties regardless of what they ask them in the near future. Next slide, please. And once they feel that the friendship and emotional ties are ripe, they start the isolation process. And this is also another important step. And throughout this journey, if we can intervene up until the sixth step, our jobs are going to be easier to stop the recruitment process. But once this process jumps into the seventh and eighth element, it's going to be too late. Isolation works very well for the subjects because not only mentally, but also they are physically going to be isolating their subjects into the new groups, group settings, new friends, and also increased indoctrination. So the subjects become more and more isolated through their indoctrination process, and they are not going to have anyone else surrounding them to talk about these issues. Therefore, they are going to be alone with the terrorist recruiters and their friends and their surroundings, making penetration into their mindsets from another perspective almost impossible. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the prevention of terrorist recruitment process, of course, prevention of terrorist attacks is essential because it will give us the opportunity to have less propaganda for any terrorist organization. The internet is nowadays essential in terrorist propaganda and reaching out to new and possible subjects through the internet. But the most important aspect, based on my experience and what we did in Turkey in Şanlıurfa essentially, reaching out to the family members of new subjects, particularly if they are high school students or university students. The mothers and other family members are going to be our best help to deal with the radicalization process and to help particularly the young minds so that we can reverse the course. Another important element here is the base, where people hang out, what type of front establishments they have to trap individuals into the terrorist organizations. Like it could be a bookstore, an internet cafe, a football club, you name it, depending on the circumstances and the jurisdiction. And those front establishments must be controlled very well. We must understand who is attending, for what purposes to those places, because they are the future terrorists, essentially. Next slide, please. The school and universities, high schools and particularly, are the best grounds for terrorist organizations to reach out to new members. Another important aspect, community policing. If there is a trust between the community and the law enforcement, it becomes a lot easier to reverse the course of recruitment. And through that community policing and good relationship between the community and the law enforcement, there could be hotlines and helplines where people are going to be reporting these types of activities if they are not known to the law enforcement. And in some cases, specific hotlines or tip lines for investigations or for people who would like to report works very well, which happened with the FBI, for example, after 9/11. Next slide, please. So I'm going to stop here and take your questions later on because we have only 10 minutes. I wanted to stick to my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Super, Dr. Thank you. I think there's definitely some really interesting questions there, particularly around sort of the role of the media in, some would argue censorship, some would argue, being part of the sort of constructive counterterrorism environment. I think this is a nice opportunity to transition to the second presentation we'll have indeed from Professor Schmidt himself on the use of mass media by terrorists, and then we'll follow that up, of course, with the use of the internet. So some very interwoven concepts here about sort of the role of society and the key actors and channels for communication.
Thank you.
Please. So Professor Schmidt, I will just give you a brief introduction, but you don't need too much. I think most folks by now on this call will know who you are, but Professor Schmidt is the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Terrorism and the former co-editor of Terrorism and Political Violence, two highly respected and leading journals in the field of terrorism studies. Until 2009, Professor Emeritus Schmidt held a chair in international relations at the University of St. Andrews, where he was also the director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. We've lucky at ICCT been working with Professor Schmidt for a long time, and really privileged to hand over to him now to discuss the use of mass media by terrorists and vice versa. Intriguingly, Professor Schmidt.
Yes. Well, this chapter is the one area where I have been working for 40 years and published books like Violence as Communication, Insurgent Terrorism, the Western News Media, or Terrorism in the Media. What's interesting is how much attention terrorists pay to the media. Some say 80–90% of the struggle is in the media, but if you look at counterterrorism, very little money is spent on countering the media output of terrorists. Of course, there are some counter-narratives around, but these are largely useless as long as actions and words don't meet. In this chapter 18, I explore first how terrorists have learned in the last 150 years to use the media, and then how the mass media in turn were indirectly grateful for what the terrorists gave them, namely access to mass audiences. And then we addressed the question how governments and some mass media try to prevent giving extraordinary exposure to terrorist acts. Can I have the first slide, next slide, please? Yes, here I bring two quotes, one from Osama bin Laden, just a couple of weeks after the 9/11 attacks, where he basically blames the messenger, namely the media, and says that terror is the most dreaded weapon in the modern age, and the Western media is mercilessly using it against its own people. It can add fear and helplessness in the psyche of the people of Europe and the United States. And now that's the key sentence. It means that what the enemies of the United States cannot do, its media is doing that. And 2 years later, when he had finally admitted, after Afghanistan was invaded, that he was responsible for the Manhattan raid, as he called it, he said that the effect of this deed was worth many million of books. Can you go to the next slide? Of course, these are expressions of what in the 19th century became to be known as propaganda by the deed or of the deed. It was a time when two inventions started to cooperate in some ways. One was the invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel in the 1860s, and the other was the perfection of the rotary press 2 decades later. And that suddenly gave terrorism a new punch. Before, after an attack, they had to glue posters on the walls of the city to explain their deeds. Now, mass media competing for mass audience, the cheap yellow press, did the job for them. And I would especially like to draw your attention to the third of these quotes by Saif al-Adil, who is now probably the de facto leader of Al-Qaeda, operating out of Iran, it is thought. And this shows the communication dimension of such an act. We think it was directed only against America, but it was in fact meant to trick America into attacking terrorists, but also populations indirectly through collateral damage, and so mobilize Muslims against the West. Can I have the next slide, please? One has to think of the relationship between terrorists, victims, and targets in the form of a triangle. By hitting some victims, a message is generated that then reaches several audiences. And in my writings, I identify no less than 10 audiences that terrorists try to reach. And depending on the choice of a symbolic or a human target, they can fine-tune their messages, and some of the audience will identify with the victims, which is the normal human reaction to do. Others will identify with the terrorists and be jubilant that their enemies have been hit, who are also the terrorists' enemies. Yet others identify with the government. So targeting by terrorists is a highly calculated process on which they spend a lot of time. Can we get to the next slide? In the media industry, there's something called to have a nose for news, news values, what will play with the public. And there are some rough rules, like if it bleeds, it leads, blood should go on the front page, or good news is bad news, and bad news is good news, and no news is bad news. Good news in terms of attracting mass audiences. And if we look at the 10 dominating news values of mass media, you see that 7 of the 10 are actually hit by the deeds of the terrorists. And research has shown that by magnifying their deeds and using the mass media to reach large publics, they can achieve a couple of tactical wins, like polarizing political opinion, demonstrating the vulnerability of the population to the authorities, and so on. So the news values of the media are abused by the terrorists, but often the media also use the terrorists. I remember, for instance, one incident in Tehran in 1979 when the TV crew was filming an audience and they shouted death to Jimmy Carter. And then the film director said, now the French version, mort pour Jimmy Carter. So they were orchestrating almost in a marriage of convenience because both wanted to reach a big audience. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, Antoinette? Yeah, okay. Here are some of the conclusions that this chapter draws based on my wider work in this area. The mass media are not neutral, but they are the battleground, as both terrorists from Al-Qaeda as well as from ISIS have recognized. And they managed to catch the attention of huge audience. Already when the attacks on the Munich Olympic Games took place, some 800 million people became witnesses. And some of the more recent attacks have reached audience of billions. And one of the many effects, in addition to intimidation or recruitment, as Ahmet said, is contagion. I remember one piece of research from the 1970s where somebody said, well, if we show violence on TV, it's not imitated by most people. Only 1 in 7,000 will imitate some crime he has seen on the media. But if you have mass audiences of hundreds of millions, contagion becomes a reality. And in my studies, I have shown that certain hijackings that were successful created within a period of 18 months more than 24 extra hijackings of the same type. So contagion is something real. But I also come to the conclusion that violence that is predictable and contagious is predictable to some extent, is also violence that is preventable. And that places an obligation on the media to report about certain things in a certain way. And if they don't show that responsibility themselves, and some of them show, then governments step in, which is, I think, not good, but it's the less evil. Next slide, please. Yeah. In fact, this nexus between media and terrorism, what one researcher, Brigitte Nakos, called a strange bedfellowship in a marriage, strange bedfellows in a marriage of convenience between terrorists and journalism, is a fact. That the question is, what can we do about it? And in the chapter, I go through the various guidelines that media and government have developed and suggest that these should be followed more clearly. The trouble is, this access to mass media is still very important, but with the arrival of social media that also can reach mass audiences, the editorial control that was there with the traditional mass media, though through the competition between mass media, it tended to be eroded because they wanted to be often first rather than to be wanted to be right about a story. And that is unfortunately now getting much more difficult since the arrival of the social media. And this is a topic that is addressed by various authors, including by Branislav and Darko in their contribution. So I will end here. Thank you. Back to Antoinette.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Schmidt. I think since you just mentioned our next panelist by name there, maybe I won't get in the middle and I'll just neatly hand over to either Darko or Branislav. I don't know which of the two of you wants to lead out here, but be great to hear your chapter on the use of internet for terrorist plotting and related purposes. And yeah, if you want to just give a brief introduction before you jump in, that might be the smoothest way here.
So I will be the first. I would like to, of course, thanks Professor Alex Schmidt. It is great honor, and you, Alexander, and all participants. As I said, it is a great honor and privilege to address our speech today. And Professor Todorovic and myself, we divide on two parts, and so we have to be very brief. I'm going to start with my own personal experience, starting in 2003, when our authorities intercept conversation between some jihadists in Western China with the Bosnian chapter of Al-Qaeda. We were very confused to find, for example, communication via internet, and there was just a simple messages inside in the body of like, Hassan, how are you doing? Oh, Muhammad, everything is good, but some kind of the daily conversation. But from there, we could not understand what is going on, but it was very interesting to find by that time that each conversation contained photos. So we did not understand Hassan and some kind of the family pictures, Murat with some kind of the nature in background, etc., etc. It was really confused. We know for sure that, for example, conversation was with the Bosnian part of Al-Qaeda in Bosnian part, but on the other side, there was a group headed by Hassan Maksoum, the terrorist that he was later on killed in Pakistan in some kind of the bombing there. We're talking about some kind of the Uyghur terrorist in Western China and Bosnian here. So for days, we understand that terrorists are communicating, they are using internet and communication, but we did not understand the point until one little guy with a big glass came to our office and say, why you don't unpack the photos? So we unpack the photos and we find out in binary code, of course, hidden communication. And that was the 2003, I think, 2002, 2003. Right now, of course, the jihadists are using much sophisticated technologies of encryption. And what we find out that there is, of course, few, let's say, ongoing phenomena that we can find out on internet. It is, of course, recruitment with indoctrination, propaganda directed to justification of the purpose and means of whole terrorism. Fundraising and which include collecting of money and of course sending of money, and remaining of course is a general logistics like purchasing of weapons, explosives, even vehicles and others. And of course in that sense we find out darknet as a very danger, Bitcoin as a method of payment, and this is very well known by today experts. But what is really unclear for us, that most of our colleagues agree that we can determine at least 5 kind of activities over the internet, and that our services, not all, but some, and our legislators don't understand the nature of the threat. So we find out exactly maybe exactly the 5 elements. Maybe some of our colleagues we find out the more. But this is very confusing to us. First of all, we find out activities of the terrorists by themselves on internet, of course. Second is activities of terrorist organizations and terrorist groups. Third is activities of so-called NGOs, that they are, of course, giving logistics to terrorists and terrorist organizations. Fourth is the activities of the so-called state sponsoring terrorism. And the fifth is activities directed to misusing Islam as a great world religion as a motive for execution of every kind of terrorist activities of today jihadists and etc. So the same 5 elements we can find out before every preparation, and we were not surprised to understand that on the end of the day, Austria and Vienna become jihad playground, and for 30 years, for example, all these 5 elements was visible not in Austria but in Vienna as a city. For example, each Balkanic jihadi movement or member of a Wahhabi movement, they have representation and they have presence in Vienna B circles. So for the years, we warned Austrian and particularly Vienna colleagues that there is, of course, great danger that something will happen. And finally, the terrorist activities has happened. The same things happen in France, in UK, and different countries. So we forget to learn to learn out of experience of others. And sometimes, of course, it is very difficult to say that some people are learning out of its own experience without feeling of responsibility what is going on. And on the end, before I give the word to my colleague, Professor Todorovic, what is really missing, it's a conference like this, that we know each other, that we exchange our experience, and only united we are the strongest. Professor Todorovic, I hope that I did not cross my time, and of course we will be open on end for a Q&A. Professor Todorovic, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Trifunovic. Darko Trifunovic is the director of the Institute for National and International Security, and I handle various research projects at the Institute. And this chapter, let me put a few additions to the introduction of Darko. This chapter actually handles not a simple abuse, but all types of misuse, exploitations, and whatever has to do with the internet on from the side of terrorists and terrorist organizations. In that sense, we actually try to highlight in the chapter the main topics, like determining what activities in the internet are those who are the ones that we have to fight against. Then also, in order to recognize and handle such activities, we need a proper systematization, and we need to update and further analyze these activities as time passes, and of course to put a proper list and apply preventive measures. Can I have next slide, please? Yes, actually, the main problem we face here is that we are not talking about some secluded areas or some heavily protected institutions. We are talking about a very open area, the internet, where billions actually on a daily basis go, exchange information, use some things, post elements. So we have to act without actually reducing the normal use of internet, and that brings us to the issue that it is quite difficult sometimes to separate benign and normal use of internet with hostile users, like here that we're talking about terrorists and terrorist organizations. And this brings us also to another issue, the practical application. Though this chapter might be considered for many as guide only for practitioners. Actually, a lot of people could be cajoled, brought in terrorist networks from the internet, normal common people. On the other hand, they can be quite influenced by hits that terrorist organizations are doing on the streets, on airports, on common areas. And that brings us to the point that these elements should actually be read and considered by ordinary people to see how they should fight not just advertised hackers that could hit their pocket or personal information, but also the terrorists that could in some form abuse their own existence on the internet. Could I have next slide, please? In that sense, let me just say that some general preventive measures before going to the main topic of our chapter, some general preventive measures would be the detection, recognition, and classification of such activities, then the application of automatic and semi-automatic tools for either identification or even fighting of such activities at the internet, and of course the verification of identified activities to be sure that we are actually fighting against terrorism, and that we apply preventive countermeasures in the appropriate cases. Next slide. Now, here we come to the main, we hope to think about its contribution from this chapter, and that is to propose a new system for the characterization of the misuse or abuse of the internet by terrorists, because as Darko Trifunovic mentioned previously, the traditional definition relies on propaganda, financing, training, planning, execution, cyber attacks, so that they should the appropriate instances would be able to recognize such purposes and fight them. However, the real operation on the internet should be derived by methods and the types of activities and segments of internet that these activities rely on in order to be able to fight them efficiently. And then we recognize in there which of those purposes belong to certain types of activities. In that sense, we proposed the new classification of main types of internet abuse by terrorists, and we use the shortcut of internet abuse type, IAT, being firstly direct approach over the internet, as you can see here, then secondly secret, encrypted, anonymous, and similar communications, and so on, not to read all the elements. But what is important here is that each of those types is related to at least two of the purposes or even more. And on the other hand, by starting with the check on the type of the abuse that is existing on the internet, we can more easily spot, pinpoint, and act, hopefully proactively, as Professor Schmidt mentioned, in countering such activities. Let's put one simple example. Online material, multimedia materials are something that a lot of people are posting every day, but they are not regarding terrorist organizations. They're not only for propaganda, they are also to get financing and even furthermore to use it in for training purposes. Next slide. Also, social networking platforms can be used for various activities, but let's use a good example of video games. Video games are not only something that can be used for propaganda. They are also used for training and for other types of purposes. Also, online payment tools, they have the main target in enabling undetected financing of terrorist activities. However, they are also used if unfortunately properly applied during execution of various activities. So we see that by checking the certain type of internet abuse, we can more easily find and intercept or at least counterattack such activities. And finally, just to say that cyber attacks are something that is a category of its own, but it was necessary to include it in the Chapter 19 because cyber activities and cyber attacks by one part of cyber world are the main element that has to be included in when we talk about internet. And with this, I think that I would also close our description, joint description with our colleague Professor Dr. Trifunovic regarding the Chapter 19. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to say a few words that we hope will be very practical and applied in the next time. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. That's, I think, quite an interesting set of interrelated ideas here. I think I like the organization here around the pathway towards extremism, and indeed fed by, in many instances, either media and the communications environment around it, or enabled by the online tools, in particularly in the modern area that we are discussing. So I think quite a nicely interconnected set of issues here. I'm going to start by encouraging all of those who are in this group to do use the opportunity here to ask questions. You have a fairly intimate setting, some extremely thoughtful experts here, and please, if you use the chat function to ask a question, we can find you and put a spotlight on you here. I actually see a first question from the audience. I'm actually going to take a little bit of a risk here. We don't normally do this, but in this smaller setting, I'm going to actually encourage you to turn on your microphone and your video, Mirat, and if you would like to address the participants directly, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I think technically I'm not able to open my camera on since it's been done administratively from your end, but I'm happy to pass on my question verbally in audience format. And thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the handbook. And I really thank for all presenters for this very insightful presentations. And mindful of the time, my question goes to Professor Yayla, in fact, and that I would be also happy if other participants would like to sort of join and add their thoughts. I am based in Vienna, where this is a location that's been mentioned a couple of times by Professor Schmidt and by Mr. Trifunovic in their introduction in reference to the latest terrorist attacks in November 2020. My question is, I would like to get the thoughts of Professor Yayla and others in reference to cases which involves individuals who have been radicalized or even self-radicalized before being contacted by a member of terrorist organizations. So even there are some cases that they haven't ever been contacted by any terrorist members, but they have done set up their terrorist plots in isolation with being part of any group, like Harlem Suarez case in 2015 in the United States, where an individual on behalf of ISIS have set up a terrorist plot in a US airfield in Florida, which has been prevented by intervention of FBI. But that case even in fact shows that this individual have been self-radicalized and he hasn't had any contact with any members of the ISIS, but he was basically preparing a terrorist attack, which is being prevented by FBI. And I would like to ask Professor Yayla and others in reference to what they would recommend to the states, agencies, and practitioners in preventing this self-radicalization process and eventually preventing terrorist plots. If I have a time, I would be happy to ask a second question, but this is my first question. Thank you again.
Super, great. Thank you very much, Murat. Professor Yayla, please. Indeed, self-radicalization was one of the questions I had on my list as well to ask. So it's a great question. Would love to hear your thoughts.
So thank you for the question and for your kind words. Of course, self-radicalization may not fall under regular recruitment process directly. And the internet plays a huge role. If there are no personal connections, it is mostly through the internet. And in the past, for the terrorist organization members, reaching out to terrorist propaganda or materials was always a challenge. Now with the internet, it is not. I think we are very late into the game of regulating terrorist content on the internet. I usually use the analogy with child pornography. We can extensively regulate the internet from the regard of child pornography and make sure that they do not show up in the social media. If you think about, or on the internet, if you think about the terrorist content, for years and years on YouTube, people were able to freely access to Anwar Evlaki's videos. He was in fact named as the ghost sheikh of the Al-Qaeda. After he died, he had tens of thousands of videos on YouTube and other social media platforms. And it was only after 2016, some social media companies started to wipe off those contents. So the first is, I think, regulation from the perspective of real terrorist content and making sure that they do not show up. I think the second is, again, different law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies have the capacity to see who is reaching to what, and they are doing it constantly. I think what they are not doing is getting in touch with those individuals and opening them, speaking with them openly about their activities and trying to extend a hand to stop radicalization process. Oftentimes, they either choose to monitor and to see if they are going to do something, and that enables for future terrorist activities, because you cannot always 24/7 follow someone. There are going to be cracks in that operation, let's say. So I think interactions with those subjects who are trying to reach out to different terrorist content on the internet is an essential part of the prevention process.
I add something to this. The problem is one of volume. There were so many people out on the internet. If you are in a small city-state like Singapore and you visit certain extremist websites, you can be sure that next morning somebody will knock at the door and have an interview with you. But in larger societies where there's less supervision, this is almost impossible. So, of course, the internet itself has, for instance, Facebook, tens of thousands of content moderators, but they are only eliminating some content, getting half crazy themselves by watching all these atrocities, but they are not reaching out to individual people who look on the internet for friends and meaning and answers to their question. So yes, the internet is still unregulated and largely lawless in most societies, and something will have to be done about it. But at the same time, it is difficult then to prevent legitimate users from studying websites, including researchers who study extremist websites, and suddenly they're also locked out, as happened recently with a colleague of mine by a Europol intervention. And I had to intervene and tell them that this was a good guy watching the bad guys. So yes, the problem is real here, but the number of people who get radicalized only by the internet is, I think, still small. Once they search out to terrorist groups or so, they become visible. And they are, to some extent, already visible by the sort of open internet uses they have, the hate language they use, hate letters they send, and so on. So that's something to be watched for. But given the many, many people that are vulnerable and might be radicalized, the volume is just too big for most intelligence agencies to follow them all.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. I would like to add this to emphasize what you said. In the United States, only around 10% of the prosecuted ISIS members or affiliates were radicalized through the internet alone. So like in the United States, the ratio is 10%. I also would like to address the fact that, like, if you look at the largest 3 incidents, ISIS-related incidents in the United States, the Pulse attack, San Bernardino attack, and the New York truck ramming attack, those 3 perpetrators were visited by the FBI. They knew they had connections and interactions with the terrorist materials over the internet. I think what we missed was the level of their interactions with those subjects. Even though they knew they were up to something or they were familiarizing themselves with ISIS materials on the internet, they were not able to prevent those attacks. Correction, for the New York truck ramming attack, it was done later on.
So if I might say a few words, it was very inspiring. For every kind of terrorist attack in the world, it has to fulfill 2 important components. One, of course, is operational capabilities, which means that terrorists can easily access to weapons, explosives, whatever. And second component is most important is motivation. Motivation coming from different kind of ideology. We are now don't talking about only jihadists. We are now talking about maybe next generation of terrorists inspired by neo-Stalinism or any kind of the left wings or right wings. We don't know extremist ideology. What will be the inspiration for them? What we find out in Serbia, this is our case, and I think it can apply to most of the countries. Our security officers, they cannot answer to one simple question. What is security? Is this science or not? What is the theory? What is the special methodology of the science of security? And the next questions, because of course they don't know the special methods of the science of security, we are asking them how they are producing security risk assessment, which kind of methodology they are using. And then we are coming to the ground that there is, and what we find out that there is huge gap between experts, actually, those from intelligence, police, and other law enforcement agencies. Their field experience is in huge gap with the theory. So there is this gap between theory and practice. And this gap we shall feel full, and we need to have much more influence of those practitioners. And for example, one of my latest book is a testimony of Al-Qaeda lieutenant from Bosnia, Ali Ahmet, and I can send it on group. It's in English, everyone can download it for free. And out of this testimony, we find out how one jihadist from Bahrain, how he was recruited in Bahrain, how he was brought to Jalalabad, how he was trained by Bin Laden by himself, how he was brought to Bosnia as a member of High Saudi Commission there, for example. He came to Bosnia, the High Saudi Commission, which is part of the government of Saudi Arabia, issued humanitarian papers to non-terrorists there. And I do have this document. Ali Hamad gave to me after all, etc. So it will be all available. So to conclude, the self-radicalization is not as one-man show. One guys which is coming to the internet. There is a huge network, and we produce the huge map of maybe like there is like 4,000 terrorists, and we are showing our students how they are connected, how they are fundraised, how they are doing their operations, that they understand if they are fighting against this evil, it's not one-man show. They cannot underestimate the network. And of course, we want them to be prepared. And I will conclude by this, how one sovereign state react on threats. Sovereign state react on threats using institutions. If our institutions are paralyzed by bad system of education, by bad method, by bad, let's say, security risk assessments, then security of our society is in jeopardy. Thank you, guys.
Super. Thank you very much. Interesting discussion. I want to give another opportunity from a question from the floor. We have a question from a participant named only as the Nordic Counter-Terrorism Network. I don't know who the representatives is. If you would like to unmute your microphone, you're welcome to ask a question now. Please go ahead.
So this is Andrin Raj. Ahmet knows me. Ahmet, I just wanted to find out, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the pull-push factor from the Western side, but me living in Asia and within the Muslim community, radicalization from where we are and working with Nasir Abbas, who is a resource person for us, he disagrees that the internet is a major pull-push factor for radicalization and Islamization. I come from Malaysia, so I really understand how the Islamization goes on. So internet on the pull-push factors on the Western identification method is pretty much misleading. So what do you see in this fact?
Can I go with it? Okay. In my experience and in my research, I think you are right. From the perspective of radicalization and terrorist recruitment, personal connections count a lot. I found that over 77% of the new recruits were contacted via previous personal relationships. So the internet does not play a huge role when it comes to reaching out to people and radicalizing them and recruiting them. Maybe there was an exception with the ISIS flow of foreign fighters, but most of those people were already radicalized and had connections before they were reached out through the internet. I think radicalization process and recruitment process is mostly based on personal connections, emotional attachments, and then through those attachments, an indoctrination process and radicalization process that would lead to recruitment.
Can I add something to that? It's easy to overestimate the internet, but also it's easy to underestimate the internet. Half of mankind is now connected via phones or tablets or computers to the internet. It is the nervous system of the world. And it brings people together who otherwise would never have gotten together without the easy connectivity that the internet offers. So it is a platform that has enormous implications. We had such a change in communication in the 16th century when the Gutenberg printing process really took off, and suddenly we had a polarization of Western societies between Catholics and Protestants. We had a 30 years war until this was settled in the Peace of Westphalia. So that was a century and a half of turbulence created by the spin-offs of the Gutenberg Revolution. And the spin-offs of the internet, which is only with us for 20 years or so, have not yet fully evolved. And I think its impact is enormous, and our methods of controlling it are limited. And when you now see how easily even the highest government offices in the United States have been penetrated for months without being noted, practically everybody who is on Facebook or on Twitter or on TikTok is probably also indirectly vulnerable to attacks and to various forms of influence. And this influence on the mindset of people might not be directly terroristic, but it prepares a rebellious attitude fueled by COVID and other things. So I think it's a big factor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. Okay. I wanted to, I guess, come to a point that touches on a couple of the in various ways, I guess, on the traditional media and then on the internet platforms of the day. This question of what the responsibility there is for regulation. I mean, this is obviously a hot topic for years now about what role Facebook or Twitter or other media platforms have in the regulation of their content. There's been a long line of defense from those organizations saying that we are merely a platform and we do not have any responsibility to that content. But along the way, you've seen significant internal teams, internal processes, whole host of content moderators along the way, recognizing that in fact that area is much more gray than they might like to admit. And I guess we know that it's not so much a question of if there is a conversation there, but the challenge in certainly ICCT's experience being a broker between some of these different players in the market is how to facilitate a conversation that is that builds trust and confidence and doesn't sort of push either traditional media away or technology companies away from this notion that they also have a role to play in either the technical detection or more of the sort of softer shaping of content to help pull somebody out of a relatively downward spiral of radicalization and exposure. And I'm very curious to sort of ask more of that question. Indeed, how can we create a constructive conversation there? Are there examples from other parts of your respective experiences in technology fields or others where we've seen effective public-private partnerships like this?
So I think what I'm going to address here from the perspective of self-regulation and understanding how radicalization and terrorism work on the internet. It is essential how the media companies cover terrorist activities, particularly terrorist attacks, so that they are not fueling the fire and they are not becoming a propaganda tool for those terrorist organizations. From the perspective of the social media, I think regulation of the real terrorist content is essential. But on the other hand, what we need to understand is in many cases, the social media becomes a platform where terrorist recruiters can reach out to people and then carry on through other means. They are not going to continue on or over the social media platforms they got connected. So let's say if they start with Facebook, they might go on with Telegram. And you never know. And for sure, it's not going to happen over Facebook. We need to understand that those encrypted applications are essential in their day-to-day activities and operations. So at the end of the day, it's not only the social media, but different encrypted applications terrorist organizations rely on to continue to their activities. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should not be looking at the social media and make sure that real hardcore terrorist materials are not available.
Thank you. If I may add a few things.
Yeah, I was hoping you would indeed. Yeah, that's great.
So in radicalization, of course, and radicalization on internet, we need to follow and we need to find out the elements of this radicalization that we can counter. For instance, we create, our institute have 22 inventions. One of the inventions is a deep internet software for deep internet search. And how we create this software is basically on the elements of radicalization and specific words, specific organizations, names, etc., in order to trace. But this is for intelligence. But we need to go beyond intelligence. We need to go to our legislators, because any intelligence law enforcement agency, they are powerless if they don't have a regulation and if they don't have a law that they are actually working according to the law. But how legislators in our national parliament, how they will understand the gravity of the threats if our intelligence and our police and other law enforcement agencies, if they don't understand the gravity of the threats. So that is actually a field for academia, field for scientific research, in combination with law enforcement agencies in order to make better awareness. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to wrap up this session. We're going to try to go back to the plenary for some closing remarks. Thank you very much for those who were brave enough to unmute and ask questions. I know it's not always a typical format in these things, but it's also sometimes nice to actually hear and in some cases see those that we are presenting with in a way that sort of has a faint hint of pre-COVID times. So thank you, and we'll see you in the main room in 1 second.